Welcome back for another episode of the Shoegazing Podcast. I'm Jesper Ingvaldsson of shoegazing.com, one of the largest blogs in the world on quality footwear. For this episode, I met up with Jim McCormack, a legendary bespoke shoemaker in England, who has spent over 5 decades in the trade. For more or less all of these years, he has worked as an outworker, doing bottom making for many different firms. England is the country in the world where the outworker system is the most extended. And we talk a lot about the freelance system, how it works, the pros and cons, and so on. But before that, we cover Jim McCormack's own journey into the shoemaking world. Hear stories from, for example, John Lobb back in the 70s, go through the different stages of the bespoke shoemaking scene in the UK the past 50 years, and much more. So enjoy your listen. All right, Jim McCormack, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jesper. Very nice to be here.
Yeah, finally we got the possibility to do this. I've been hunting you for a couple of years, but you are a busy man.
I've been elusive, I know, but it's good we've got together now. Yeah.
I think it's going to be really interesting because you are sort of one of the really legendary shoemakers in the trade.
One of the old boys.
Yeah, exactly. You've been around for sure.
Yes, yeah.
So a lot of people sort of know of you, but they might not know that much about you, so to speak. So we'll hopefully rectify a bit of that, and then we're going to talk about the freelance bespoke system that you have here in the UK. But let's start with you, so to speak. And first of all, how did your journey in shoemaking begin?
Well, it started when I was still at school, really. I was a young teenager and I had a part-time job at a local shoe repair shop.
Okay.
And it just so happened the guy that ran the shop in the past had been an orthopedic maker. And he used to tell me stories about it and I got interested. And as a sort of 14, 15-year-old, I decided I wanted to be a shoemaker.
All right. That's early.
Everybody around me thought, why? Exactly. What are you doing? But I was quite determined. And so when I left school, I got an apprenticeship in London because where I was living was only a short commute into London with an orthopedic shoemaker in the East End. And that's really my first sort of proper job in shoemaking. So I worked there for a couple of years, really enjoyed it, didn't know anything about the West End, but I got to hear about the West End and it sounded interesting.
Yeah.
So I found out a little bit about it. And of course, this was before the internet, phones, you just had to either go into London and wander around or look things up in libraries. Anyway, I found out about Lobb. And I remember the first time I went to the West End, I went to James Street, which is off Oxford Street, not St James's Street. So I couldn't find Lobb. Anyway, I eventually found them and I applied to them and I got an interview.
Yeah.
And, making shoes then it wasn't funky or popular. It was a bit of an unusual trade. Not many youngsters in it.
Yeah.
And the ones that were in it were a bit bohemian, kind of crafty types, Anyway, I got accepted because I had a little bit of shoemaking experience from the orthopedic. And then I went to Lobb and I did my apprenticeship there. And then you were kind of spat out at the end to be self-employed, ready or not. Yeah. And I didn't feel ready at all. But, it was deemed that I was ready.
I see.
So I think at the age of 21, I was a self-employed shoemaker, which was pretty daunting. because I could make a shoe, but it took me a long time.
Yeah. How was it to be at Lobb in the 70s when you apprenticed?
Great fun.
Yeah.
It was quite formal, very busy. Lots of the older shoemakers still around. And just really interesting place to work. I don't know that youngsters would like the formality of it now.
It was sort of strict traditionally.
Strict, upstairs, downstairs, but not in a bad way, but, just disciplined, and it was the makers were nearly all men. Yeah. And they were good to us. I think, they liked the fact that there were young people around. Yeah. And a lot of them had come out of the war, had come to London, because in my experience, the bespoke making world is a complete melting pot of every nationality you could think.
There was a lot of Polish guys there, right? Yeah,
there was a lot of we called them Polish, which was probably not right. They were Polish, maybe the Baltic states. But it was all, it was all sort of lumped into one. We didn't have a clue. We weren't being disrespectful. We just didn't understand, So we said they were all Polish, but we didn't know that. And there were lots of them, and they had a great work ethic. Yeah, and they were great craftsmen. Yeah. And they were generally very cliquey, good friends to each other. But there were Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots, Greek, Hungarian, Italian, Maltese. There was a West Indian guy. There was, but no Japanese at that time. No, the Japanese shoe world hadn't kind of started then. But it was a little bit difficult to get tuition. We had a teacher, and that was his job. He taught, I think, in the room at Lobb. Have you been into the? Yeah, exactly.
Of course, I assume there was a lot of more staff at that time, but sort of the premises is a lot of it they still have, so to speak.
In those days in the 70s, it was bustling. There was a lot of people there doing a lot of stuff. And in that little room, the maker's room downstairs, at one time there were 6 people in there. Yeah. So it got a bit hot and, a bit fraught sometimes, but it was a good atmosphere to learn. But you would find that a lot of the makers would come in and what we call shop their work. So people that worked in a workshop at home or a workshop in London, because Lobb had a separate place in Soho where the tree makers were. And on the top of that building, on the first floor, was a room for makers. And the makers could pay a very small rent and rent a piece of space. Yeah.
So they were sort of half freelancers, or
no? They were freelance. They could do whatever work they wanted.
Oh, okay, they could.
Because they paid for their sort of ground rent. But the shops were a little bit more controlling over who you work for in subtle ways, and they were busy. So you could often work for one shop and have enough work. You wouldn't need to necessarily. So what I was saying about getting information out of the makers, they would come in and shop their work, and we'd hear them come in, and we'd go, and we were very polite to them. We'd call them Mr. Harrison, Mr. Knievy or whatever, and we would ask, "Can we look at your work?" Because we were scared of them, and they were very nice to us, but you wouldn't get any info about how to do things. No. It was kind of, well, that's for me to know and for you to find out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But there was no sort of the plan was all along that you should sort of, as you mentioned, come out the other way and work for yourself, not to be employed by Lobb.
Yeah. I mean, that was... So you could go into Lobb. So when I first went there was no room in the making room. So I worked in the shop upstairs doing last adjustments, seeing customers.
Okay, you did that first, yeah.
Yeah, but only on a very basic way. So if a client came into the shop, I would go in and greet them and find out what they wanted, and then get somebody who knew what they were doing to see them, because I was just the boy, you know. And then I did last adjustments and general running around. And then there was a space in the making room. There was another guy that had come to Lobb a few weeks, I think, before me, and he was offered it first, but he was doing last work the same as I was, and he liked that. So he passed on it, and I got the space in the workshop. And I didn't have a clue how long I would be there, because it's not a formal apprenticeship.
It depends on when you're sort of ready.
It depends how you progress, and you know, it's not. I know you can go to college and learn shoemaking, but it's a sort of oral and visual tradition, really. And you, especially if you're working with somebody where they're not a natural English speaker, what you see is often more important than talking about it. You can see how they do it, and you can learn a lot that way. But yeah, so I was there, I think I was there from 75 through to 79. And then, so at 21, that was 79, I was out in the big wide world, you know.
And how was that? You mentioned it was frightening, but...
Yeah, well, I still lived at home with my parents, had a little workshop in the back garden, a little shed sort of. And, and I sat there and I just thought, I'm not going to earn any money here. You know, not that I wasn't driven by money, but obviously you've got to pay, you know, your parents, you know, you've got to pay bills and do things. So to supplement it, I did work on the side. I did repairs, and I still had a connection with the orthopedic maker, and I would go and do a little bit of side work for them.
How old were you at this stage?
Well, I was 21.
21 years old.
And all I did was I just worked long hours and tried to perfect what I was doing, because I didn't feel I was, you know, I'd got the hang of it properly. I just tried to repeat what I'd been taught, you know, just over and over again doing it, you know, and that's how you kind of learn and perfect things, you know. And then, you know, you get a little bit quicker and you get a bit more confident with different types of work. And then I sort of branched out a little bit, because I was always told by my teacher, you can't just work for one shop. Yeah. You've got to have what they call a buy-stroke. So that if work gets short or dries up or something happens, you've always got something else to fall back on. Yeah. And he said, so when you're ready, and he said, you're not ready yet, your work's not good enough, go to Foster's. He said, that'll be a good shop to work for, because he'd worked for them. So I'm not quite sure when. I think it would have been the early 80s, maybe 82, 83. I plucked up my courage. I had a finished job that I'd done for Lobb. So I went into Foster's, introduced myself. I met Terry Moore, and the various guys that were there.
He's the like legendary last maker of Foster's.
Yeah, fantastic guy. Really was good to me. Brought my shoemaking on a complete different level, really. So they looked at the work and they said, well, yeah, it's not bad, but there's a few things that we'd like different. So they said, we'll give you a job and see how you get on. So I thought, great. So I went back, I think, a week later, and they'd had a job ready for me. And it was for the owner. A fellow called Mr. Chester was the owner of Lobb at the time. And so it was a pair for him. For Foster's, yeah. It was a pair for him, which that was pretty intimidating. But the idea was that it wasn't a customer. If it wasn't just right, it was okay for the boss, Anyway, so I did that, and they were happy, but they wanted to sort of knock the edges off me a bit. And getting to know Terry, he was very engaged in my improvement, because it would make the work better. So, I'd bring the work in because I used to deliver it all then. And in those days we were paid in cash, which was fantastic because you'd work all week and then you'd maybe go to London on a Saturday and you'd come away feeling $1 million. I mean, you might only have 100 quid in your pocket.
How much did you have left after staying at the pub on your way home?
Well, yeah, we would maybe go to the pub, but if you were on your own, because you kind of lost contact a bit with some of your colleagues once you went self-employed. But it was good times. It was innocent times, different times. And, Terry would sort of critique me in a very good way. He'd say, well, try doing this a bit different. Try this. And although he wasn't really a maker, because he had been in the game so long and seen so much, he knew what it should look like. So he was a big influence on me. And their house style was different from Lobb. Not better or, anything completely different, but just the last shapes were a bit different and the finishes they liked were a bit different.
Yeah.
And then, that's part of the beauty of being an outworker. Although the shop that you work for would like you to be exclusive to them, and they will try and keep you on course as such, you're at liberty to work for whoever you want. And, if opportunities come up, you're going to investigate them, because you just don't know where it leads,
But have you, through the years, sort of been in-house for any company since at the time with Lobb, or only freelancing? Yeah.
The only time was with Gaziano and Gerling. So I knew Tony. I didn't know him when he was at Cleverly, but he got in touch with me when he was with Edward Green. He ran the bespoke, short-lived bespoke department for Edward Green. So we worked together then, and then he told me he was setting up with Dean, and I worked for G&G from the beginning. And at some point, I think it was round about 2012, they wanted to get me on board a bit more. So they offered me a contract where they paid me a certain amount per month.
Like more of a salary.
Yeah, I had to produce a certain amount of work, but I was free if I had more time to still do other work.
Yeah.
And that was great. For the first time ever, I had money coming in every month, but I made a complete muck up of it because I obviously had to give most of my production to G&G, but I still had loyalty to people like Lobb and Foster's. And I said at Foster's, look, I still work for you, but I can't do as much. And that caused a little bit of friction. And I ended up not really pleasing anybody.
Okay.
That only lasted about a year.
All right. Yeah.
And I just thought, stick to just stick to what you know.
Yeah.
You know. So that's the only time I've ever had that.
Yeah. So through the years, roughly how many different companies have you made shoes for, would you say? You know?
I don't, but you name them. I've probably, so I've worked for Lobb, I've worked for Foster, I worked for Cleverly, only for a very short period. I worked for, there was a guy in Fulham, Tony Andrews.
Yeah.
He's no longer working. I worked for Bermondsey Bootmakers, which was a guy that had worked at Lobb that set up on his own. That would have been in the early 80s. Jason Amesbury, G&G, Edward Green when they were doing stuff. I've worked for a couple of European ones. Yeah, just doing odd, odd jobs here and there.
Yeah.
So generally the West End side of it, I've worked at some point for everybody.
I mean, you've been 5 decades in the trade, which is quite amazing in itself. But if we look at it sort of from a macro perspective, or what you would call it, if you would go through each decade and sort of summarize each, how would you describe the status of the West End shoemaking in each of them, and what sort of changed from the previous one? If we start with the 70s and go from there.
I think in the 70s there was lots of work. Although talking to guys like Terry, who used to do their American trips, were big, long-winded trips. They used to get a lot of work. He said, well, if you think we're busy now, he said back then, maybe 15 years before that, he said we were even more busy. Because I think bespoke shoes were a bit more affordable then. I don't know. It was, and people dressed that way. More people wore formal shoes. When you look around now, when I go on the tube, I despair sometimes. I saw a guy on the tube today, nicely dressed. He had a nice blazer, nice shirt, bit of a jumper and some sort of chinos, and a pair of shoes that looked like they'd never seen a bit of polish on them. And I just thought,
yeah, but I guess that was sort of it, that it's people with money back then and wearing sort of formal clothing, and they would go for bespoke shoes as well.
Yeah.
All the time, basically.
Yeah.
While nowadays, even if you see guys with bespoke suits, there's often a pair of Crockett's or some other sort of ready-to-wear shoes paired with that. It's not standard with bespoke shoes in the same way anymore.
No. And it was very formal, the sort of uniform of bespoke. So I'd say the 70s were, and a big thing is that it was pre-internet, pre-mobile phone, pre-all that. So it was a bit more of a secret world. We weren't so well known, now we sometimes describe it as the genie's out of the bottle.
Exactly.
The secret's out, which in some ways is a good thing. I think for the youngsters ongoing, it's a good thing. Yeah. But some of the slight mystery about it is lost, Lost, yeah.
And then if you go into the 80s, how was it at that time, and what changed?
Into the 80s, there was still plenty of work around. And I say it was the first bit of people that had been freelancers or outworkers going their own way. Right. So I mentioned Bermondsey Bootmakers. So that was started up by a fellow called David Lobb. No relation.
Okay, just
happened to be the same name. And David had been taught by the same guy that taught me at Lobb. I don't know if you've ever heard of a maker called Cookie.
No, don't think so.
So in the West End circuit of outworkers, Cookie was very well known. much admired by a lot of the Japanese guys. Jason Amesbury, Nick Templeman. He was a lovely guy, Cookie. He was like a rocker, you know. He had long hair, tattoos, a beard. Very
I think
very gently
I've
spoken.
heard about him. Yeah.
So Cookie was another guy that was taught by Morris, who taught me. And Cookie used to experiment with, making leather goods and making shoes outside of the West End. But David took it a step further and he set up Bermondsey Bootmakers with a couple of interested friends. And he bought part of a warehouse in Bermondsey, and it was a kind of studio workshop. And he got me on board as an outworker because I had learnt to make turn shoes and French pumps when I was at Lobb. And he wanted that as an offer, for his clients. So, and then you had Jason Amesbury a bit later in the 80s. He set up on his own. Now, I don't think in the 70s you'd have found it very easy to set up on your own, because the big firms had quite a hold over the whole of the West End.
Yeah,
really.
And all the outworkers and
Yeah, and you'd be scared that if you set up on your own that you'd never get any other work again. So you'd have to be quite brave to go down that road.
And they sort of opened up that road for others then.
Yeah, early on, yeah.
I mean, but if we go over to the 90s, then my feeling is sort of that a lot happened during the 90s.
In which way?
No, in that there were several firms that disappeared. And
yeah, you're right. Yeah. So it did sort of get diluted a bit, really. But there was still more, quite a bit of work around. But I think it was noticeable decade by decade there was less work.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think the companies had to work harder to bring the work in. So they were travelling to perhaps different places. I'm not quite sure when. I think it might have been in the late 90s that people started travelling to Japan. So that might have been the very beginnings of the big Japanese interest in British shoemaking. Would you agree
I
with
think
that?
it's the late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah.
Because I remember Terry Moore going over to Japan. I think it's in Tokyo. Is there a big sort of luxury department store there?
Isetan, probably.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think he went there and had a kind of a little trunk show almost, which was quite an eye-opener for him, because he was a lad from the East End of London. And he brought back all these orders, and I did a lot of the making. And actually, my name had become known. And I think I know why, because Jason Amesbury, who I'd worked for, was very big on Japanese culture. He was a big fan of Japan. And he taught some of the early Japanese shoemakers.
Yeah, there's several
the British style.
Yeah, and through the years, many Japanese trained with him.
Yeah. And I was an outworker for Jason, and I met a lot of these guys, and they liked my work. And Jason always used to give me a good write-up, And he would sometimes, so his students would come and they couldn't stay. I think they'd be on a student visa or something, and would eventually have to go back to Japan. And at the end of their time with Jason, he'd ring me and say, look, he's going back to Japan. Could you have him at your workshop for a couple of days? It would make his day, So I had a number of them come and spend 2 or 3 days with me.
Okay.
No money changed hands. It was just, a kind of favour to Jason. So I think this was the beginning of the branching out more to different markets, perhaps.
Did that continue in the noughties, the sort of internationalization of West End firms?
Yeah, although they'd always travelled.
But to more markets, so to speak,
I think
Asia.
And and there was always European travel, but the different shops, like Lobb always had a big itinerary of where they travelled. Foster's not so much. And then Cleverly's have always been, pretty international. I don't know about any of the smaller firms that I didn't really have much involvement with, but big connection with America, of course, because that's a big market even today.
That there feels like there's always been travel to the US for the West End firms.
Yeah. And they did it. It was almost like an exodus that they did, and there was big connections with the tailors. So that's how a lot of the tailors and the shoemakers got to know each other and formed little sort of cliques, So there'd be many a Savile Row tailor with a nice pair of shoes, and then you'd have the shoemaker or the last maker with a lovely suit. No money changed hands.
Exactly.
But that's a nice thing, isn't it?
I still see today, when shoemakers and tailors.
I just wish. I think Daniel's managed to get a connection, and Dominic. And Nick Templeman with a few tailors,
Yeah, exactly.
But I've never met anybody that's taken me on,
Especially since you don't meet the customers in the same way.
No,
I guess you're not in the same need of that type of things.
No. And I did probably in the 90s dip my toe into. This would be the late 90s, I think. Dip my toe into doing my own thing.
Yeah, exactly. You've had that sort of a little bit.
I really did. I was very tentative, and I do admire the people that have done it, because it's a big step to make. And I dipped my toe into it, and I think I realised that when you do that, you become your own company or firm. The amount of extra work you have to do that's not shoemaking is massive. Going to buy your leather, I always like to go in person. I don't like to do it over the postal system or whatever. I like to go there, much to the annoyance of the leather merchants, but go there and see what you're buying. Going to see the client, emails and all the kind of stuff you have to do, all the admin,
brand building, and
and I did it, and I never had a website. I started a web. I've still got it in sort of cobwebs, mothballs, or whatever you call it. I never did launch it because after trying to juggle doing my own thing and outworking, I thought, do you know what? Stick at what you know. Stick at what you think you're good at. And I'm not a good front man. If you take somebody like Dominic is the perfect, front man for a business, because he's got that customer. He can empathise with them. And I'm just a bit shyer than that. So I'd rather be in the back room doing the work, and it works for me. So,
obviously it has.
And I had a few private customers. I've still got them, but as we get older, the amount of work they take on is less. Yeah,
and then if we sort of go into the onesies and when internet really had arrived, and as you mentioned, Instagram and all that.
Yes.
If you look at the West End bespoke scene at that time, how would you describe it?
Well, it's for us outworkers, it was our moment in the spotlight, perhaps, And in hindsight, I don't know whether it will be seen as a good thing, but you can't turn off the gas as such, can you?
Yeah.
What's done's done. And some of us became sort of minor celebrities, very minor celebrities, and we got known.
Yeah, I mean, in the shoe world, as I mentioned, you're a legendary name, and I assume it was a much smaller amount of people who knew you before the internet era. So
absolutely, yeah. And so I think for the young aspiring shoemaker now, it's probably essential. You need a presence on Instagram. Yeah. You need a good website, although I think Instagram is even more out there. I know there's other platforms.
We have TikTok and those nowadays, but I still think Instagram is the main thing for this part.
Yeah.
And for the shoemaking scene, the West End shoemaking scene as a whole, how did that evolve?
Well, I think what it's done is and this is only my opinion, I think it's made younger shoemakers not really want a life as an outworker, the same as myself, Dominic, and various others. We were happy with our lot because we didn't know anything different. And that concerns me a little bit because I worry, how do the bigger firms keep a younger workforce? Because, I'm not going to be working for, I'll see what I'm like when I'm 70, although the guy that taught me the pump work, Ronnie McNichol, he worked up until he was 90. But I can't see that happening.
25 more years in there.
Yeah, well, we'll see. So, and what's important about the West End shops is training. Because without that kind of establishment to train people, it's lovely if you set up a business and you're a 1 or 2 or 3 people workshop. You're not going to have the time or the finances to train somebody,
And a place like Lobb are still quite essential for that.
Absolutely,
And also today, so to speak.
Yeah. And what you get from Lobb is the variety of work. You get a huge variety of work because there's still a big outfit in the bespoke world, and you'll get you could get a slipper, you could get a riding boot, whereas some of the smaller independent, they don't really offer that. It's too specialized. So you get great experience from one of the bigger companies. And that's really good if you're going to be an outworker, because you can then take on all kinds of work. But everybody seems to aspire now to be their own brand, which is, is fine. It's fine. And I think if it had been different times, I'd probably be that person as well.
Interesting journey to go through, so to speak. All right. For those who don't know, could you sort of explain how the outworker system or freelance system, or what you would call it, in the British bespoke shoemaking industry, how that works?
Yeah. Well, generally, the last makers are always in-house.
Yeah.
And you will have whoever measures you in the shop will make the last. That's the ideal scenario.
Yeah.
You could get in some of the bigger shops. You might get a different last maker work to somebody else's measures, but they have to have a good understanding of how each person works. So generally, you would measure and make the last. On the whole, all the closers and the bottom makers are freelance. Very rare to get somebody in-house, although in more recent years there are a few.
And they are almost always separate. You have the closers who do the upper making, and you have the bottom makers who do the making and finishing.
Yeah, certainly back in my day, and I think even now, if you went to somewhere for tuition, they would teach you one discipline. They'll teach you last making, they'll teach you closing, or they'll teach you bottom making. They won't teach you all three. And you can understand why. One, it would take forever. And plus, what are you going to do? You're going to go off and do your own thing. So being part of a team as such makes you concentrate on what you do, really. So you would get some of the shops have space where they would have outworkers, although they're working on the premises, they're piece workers, and they're not so much outworkers. They would pay a very small rent. So if I worked in the basement of Lobb, I would pay what they call a peppercorn rent, a very small rent for that little bit of space. But I would be paid per job.
Okay. But only Lobb shoes there, so to speak.
Yes, generally. Although on a Saturday morning when there's nobody around, you could always do a private job. Generally, a lot of us work from home in a little outbuilding or a workshop. Or I remember going to one fella to take some work to him, and he worked in the porch of his house.
Okay, outside.
Well, it was sort of like you come in the front door and there was a bit of a sort of cloakroom come porch.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But a tiny space, and he could just about stretch his arms out. And I just thought, God, this is brutal. This is, but So we generally work from a small outbuilding or something, and then we would deliver our work, collect our work. A lot of it's done by courier now, so we don't have to go into London. And
when you get you as a bottom maker, what do you sort of receive from the houses that you work with?
So you get the last, you get the upper, you get a bundle of leather, quite a substantial bunch of leather actually.
Yeah, for all the different pieces.
And you get a work ticket. You may get some drawings. You may get the odd pattern, like a heel pattern, or just maybe a pattern shoe for a certain detail that the customer wants on that shoe. So, and that work ticket will give you all the instructions of how it should look and what type of finish and how much welt should show, all these details. And so you make that up to their requirements, and then you send it back and you get paid a fee for that. And it's a scale of fees. So if a shoe has a welted seat, that's more work. So you would get paid a certain amount more. Yeah. A riding boot would be a different price from a dress shoe because it's more work. And that's how you're paid. You're paid on a job by job basis, And
are all the outworkers get the same payment, or you as a very skilled one, do you get more than some others? And this was always a bit of a bone of contention back in a few years back. It's a bit different now. All levels of work were paid the same. And the guy that spent a lot of time getting that extra finish or finer stitching, he was almost taxed really for spending the time, But yes, you get paid the rate, and it's up to you how long you take doing it, If you're a very fast worker, some people are just generally fast. Doesn't mean they're not good. They're just very efficient how they work. Some people are very meticulous and slow. I was never a fast maker. But, I was sort of, mid.
I was efficient, but, I couldn't turn lots of work out. I probably, in my prime, 2.5 pairs a week, depending on what kind of work it was, One amazing week, I did 4 pairs in 1 week.
But then you worked much more than a regular
ridiculous, work. And I was, the following week I was in bits because I'd worked so hard I could hardly do anything, so it was pointless. But you find your level, and you find your thing. Now, if you've got a specialism, you can probably ask a different price.
Okay. So it's a bit more sort of level.
A bit more flexibility. And some of the, some people will pay a little bit more for certain work, But you've got to be realistic. You can't just be demanding silly money. You can't become a prima donna. You've got to realise that the cost of the shoes, the making price is built in. You can't demand silly money.
But looking back at it historically, has the bespoke shoemaking sphere in the UK always been set up this way with outworkers? Do you know?
Well, I think so. Adele, who I spoke to the other day, pointed out something to me because we talked about
works at Trickers,
works
run
at
their
Trickers,
bespoke department.
And she said, well, could it be so the high-end makers, don't forget, back in maybe the 1800s, there would have been so many more shoemakers around.
Yeah.
I think it was the biggest handcraft in London because everybody needed shoes.
Yeah, and there were shoemakers everywhere in London.
But they weren't all making the same level of work. The West End would have been the top
exactly.
level. Now, you think about it, if you're a West End shoemaker, your premises need to be in the expensive areas of London. So you can't afford necessarily to have a big building with many outworkers working, on the premises.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay, yeah.
I mean, if you look at Lobb, is quite a big building. Foster's was never big. Cleverly's is very small.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think they have got a maker working in-house there, but it's very tiny. So that could be part of it, that the space need.
They had expensive rents for the front end, so to speak, the sort of
the
advertising windows and showrooms, and then they needed to have cheaper premises for the ones who did the work. So that makes sense that it could be a reason.
So we spoke about before, Lobb had a house in Soho.
Yeah, exactly.
That was the tree maker. They used to turn the laths and the trees, and the upper floor was a place for makers, and they could rent a space there. And that's where I saw, this is quite an interesting little story. Have you ever heard the story about that makers would work in a room, but some would work with a curtain around them? So that
not to show their
So
work.
this is before my day. Competition for work was very high, and makers did not want to show their tricks to anyone else because it could take work from them. So the story was that they would work behind a curtain, and nobody could see anything. And the only way you could ever get any info out of anybody is take them to the pub, buy them a few drinks. If they liked you, they might tell you something, or they may just tell you a load of rubbish and just make a fool of you, But it was it wasn't really like that in my day, but previous generations. But in the old Victorian house in Soho, there were in the main room there, I think there'd be 4 or 5 makers in there, and they were sort of each had their little corner. There was a curtain rail, a sort of circular rail that a guy would have worked behind. There was nobody working in that way then, but that's how different it was back in those times.
Yeah.
But what an interesting place to go to. I just wish if I could go back to the 70s, for a day.
And see
the questions I would have had. I would have asked so many questions, but at the time you think it's going to be there forever.
Yeah, exactly. You don't think why it's like that. And yeah, interesting. And you mentioned that sort of one thing that has changed is that it's a bit more individual, the price that you get paid, the fee that you get paid. But in other ways, has the freelance system changed since you started? In shoemaking? No,
I don't think so. The price thing, it's all there or thereabouts. It's not a massive difference. No, I think if you're I think one thing that might be different is I think if you work for the West End firms, they seem to be happy for you to work as an outworker, but also run your own little business on the side as well. Yeah, which would never have happened before, I don't think.
No, because there's several who do that, so to speak, which is a good thing.
Yes,
because then, as you talked about, for young people to get in, they might still want the brand and sort of work with that, enjoy that.
Yeah,
but it's difficult to start a new brand.
With the best one in the world, you can set yourself up as a shoemaker with a lovely website and some lovely samples, but where are you going to get your clients from? And, you don't need many clients. If you're a one-man band, you don't need that many to keep you busy. But it's not a constant stream of work. So you've got your workshop rent or whatever. You do need a different source of income, So I know a number of makers that are doing a bit of outwork and then doing their own work.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the Japanese makers do that because there's so much competition over there.
Yeah, and there's many Japanese guys who work as outworkers for the British companies and
there are
the European companies.
Yeah. That could be something that has changed probably a bit more recently, is that the West End companies are sending work further afield than they ever would.
Yeah.
Because they have to, because there's just not the number of people doing the work anymore,
If you look at it today, how many, in rough numbers, how many outworkers, be it closers or bottom makers, etc., are there in the UK today, would you say?
It's hard to know. It really is hard to know. Closers, very few. Very few. I would say 10 or 15, maybe. There's levels of work, but working for the West End as such, maybe 10 or 15. Makers, 50. I don't know really. There's people that dip in and dip out,
But it's not many.
It's not many, no.
And we should mention that also, also small independent firms like Nicholas Templeman or William Laborde or those guys, they also use outworkers, so to speak, in a way for part of their job. It's not that many who sort of do it all themselves.
No, I would say you've got Dominic, who does everything himself. You've got Sebastian, who I think for his own private work, I think he does it all himself. Certainly when I've had private customers, unless it was a very plain upper, I would use a closer because I can't produce that quality of work. I guess Daniel can close
And now he has Samuel Northworthy, who is sort of
in-house. He's his in-house closer, yeah.
We talk numbers for the outworkers, but in-house workers, then, especially then for the large companies, how many of those would it be today in the UK, would you say?
Well, not many. And after COVID, a lot of places, well, we, for all intents and purposes, lost Fosters.
Or it's Cannons, but it's a different thing, I guess, now.
Yeah, I would say the nearest you've got to Fosters in the old way would be Amico.
Okay, yeah, exactly.
Although I know Cannons have got all the archive, you know. And, you know, good luck to all of them, because we don't want the Fosters aesthetic to go.
No, definitely. I mean, it
was my favourite shop to work for, you know, partly because of Terry and the gang that were there. And I just liked the look of the shoes, you know, it kind of struck the balance that I liked.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's small staff because staff are expensive, and if they're on salary, you know. So Lobb are a much leaner machine than they were. Like I say, we've lost Fosters. I mean, the Cannons, I think, are quite lean, you know, only a few people in-house. Cleverly's a pretty tight little team. You've got Nick Temperman, who is a one-man band, you know, who gets his closing and some of his making done. So small is the way, I think, you know. I think we learned over the COVID period that if you're small and lean, you can ride the ups and downs easier. You know.
I mean, if we generalize a bit, the UK bespoke show companies, they have very small in-house workshops and depend on the outworkers to a much larger degree than what I'd say is any other country, you know, Italy, France, Japan. Standard is to have at least more of the work done in-house, so to speak, even if it's still sort of closer and bottleneck, but it's done in-house. Why do you think this is?
Well, I really don't know. I've got no idea what that would be. I mean, you'd think it would be said that if it's all in-house, then there's more control over it. But even when it's sent out to outworkers, the in-house person has got a lot of control over what happens. So the last maker that would kind of boss the job, he'll inspect the work at every stage. So the uppers get signed off. The maker is chosen very carefully. So they will give the work to the right kind of maker. So it's very much controlled, even though it goes out of the shop. But I really don't know, apart from the thing of space and flexibility of your workforce, you know.
What would be the main cons for the companies with this setup?
Well, only that you haven't got a full control over the workforce, you know. I mean, it's a partnership, isn't it? You know, it's not them and us, because we all need each other. But yeah, it means that, you know, if a maker or a closer gets a better offer, they could disappear, you know. But, you know, if you value something, you look after it, don't you? You know, so at the end, it's all teamwork, you know. Unless you're that one-man band that can do everything, you need to make the best quality product. You need a team, you know. And if you treat each other well, then you get the best out of each other, you know. So
for you as a outworker, as a shoemaker, what do you appreciate the most with working as a freelancer?
Well, it's freedom, right? You can. I mean, to be a good outworker, you've got to be very disciplined, because you can sit there and read the paper or eat biscuits and drink cups of tea and never get anything done. Can keep putting it off. So you need to be disciplined, and you need to be organised. But if you don't like getting up at 7 a.m, you want to go in the workshop at 10 o'clock. Or like me, nowadays, I'm in the workshop at about 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock
in the afternoon.
Nice.
Yeah. But I work in the evening as well. So I roughly work from, say, 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and then maybe 7 o'clock to 9:30 in the evening. Not always, but, so I can make my day whatever I want it to be. I have worked till 2 a.m. in the past when I've had to get an urgent job out. So you've got that flexibility. And providing you get your work done and you can meet your deadlines, then you can go off scuba diving like I do.
Yeah.
So that's the main thing, freedom. And you work on your own, which is not for everybody. So sometimes and I've done it in the past, I've had a little workshop locally where I lived that I shared with a couple of other craftsmen.
Yeah, exactly,
I shared a workshop with a wood carver and his partner who did this silk dyeing, batik. It's a kind of silk dyeing that you do with wax.
Yeah, all right.
And we were in a lovely little villagey part of St Albans. We had this old stable block and we had the workshop. It was idyllic. And the little villagey part had about 3 pubs. And we got this workshop, and this fella, Frank, he said, let's go to the pub at lunchtime. I said, yeah, great. So that's what we did. We'd have a couple of pints and we'd come back. And we did this for the first week or so. And I said, I can't carry on doing this. I said, because I can't get any work done in the afternoon. Whereas he seemed to come alive in the afternoon.
Okay.
It used to inspire him because he was a bit of a madman, really. So I said, look, Frank, I will maybe go to the pub after we've done our day's work for a beer. But I am not going to the pub at lunchtime. And it was lovely. It was really idyllic. But he then struggled to find his rent, and all the rent of the building was in my name. So we had to part company. So it's the freedom thing and being able to work for who you want, because you'll find that you work for a team and you get on with them. They like your work, you click, and, it makes for a better thing,
And what would be the main cons for you as shoemaker?
Well, I guess the lack of security, really, and the possibility that you'll kind of stray away. You don't keep that discipline, and I think many people have found that the shoemaking's quite hard, and they maybe experiment doing other kinds of leather work, which is fine. But I think if you're going to be the best shoemaker you can be, you've kind of got to focus on it.
And how is it financially? You mentioned already, which I think I've both written and talked about a lot before that. I mean, if you want to get rich, don't become a shoemaker.
Or start a company.
Yeah, or start a company. Yeah. But if you look at it financially, how does it differ, would you say, between being an employee and an outworker?
Well, having never really been an employee, it's hard to say, but you'll get a salary which will have perks with it. You might get a bit of medical care. You'll certainly now have a pension scheme, because they have to offer a pension scheme. Sick pay, as an outworker, as a maker or a closer, you don't get sick. No. You're not allowed to. I could count on one hand the number of days I've had off work in all them years. Once maybe when I had flu.
But is it like painkillers and...
Yeah, you drag yourself there. Yeah. Drag yourself there. Even if you're not very productive, you do something. So you could get there, feel like death warmed up, and you may not do a challenging job. You might just skive a few stiffeners, make a few threads, do something for the next day. So, and you'd get holiday pay, wouldn't you, as an employee? But you know, if the sun's shining and I want to sit in the garden and read a book for an hour, I can do it, and that's worth a lot of money to me. You know.
Because you work from a place, like at your home, basically.
Yeah, so we've got a house in St Albans. My commute from the breakfast table to my workshop is about 20 paces. So I've got a little workshop with a stable door, the door that can open. The top can open, or the bottom can open, like on a horse stable. You know. But
sort of in a way, it's a quite modern way to work. You can work from anywhere, as you mentioned. You decide over your own time and so on. It's sort of how people, like in the tech industry or stuff like that, works now after the pandemic to a larger degree. It was sort of pioneers.
Well, you could say that. And, you know, when we had lockdown, I mean, I joked with a few people. I said, lockdown was fine for me. I said, because I've been in isolation for the last 40 years, sat in a shed. I said, you know, it was only that work got very scarce near the end of it. So from that point of view, and, you know, a lot of people have a home office, you know, a building in the garden. And, maybe it is the future, you know. I mean, but in the shoemaking game, we've been doing it for years. Yeah.
All right, we've been talking for a long time. Just one final question: where do you see the UK bespoke shoemaking scene head in the coming decades?
Well, I hope that it will thrive.
Yeah,
because, you know, it's given me a good life, and, you know, it's such an interesting trade. I think it will change. I do worry for the bigger houses, but they're resilient. And, you know, I think they're making a few changes.
Yeah, they adapt, sort of.
Yeah, to adapt, So that's all good. I'd encourage everybody to, you know, give them the good stroke, the bigger shops. You know, they're not, they're not the shoemaker that everyone wants to go to, but they're very valuable to us all. And then for the, I think the trade will be a lot more independence, as we're seeing. I don't think all those will survive because, you know, it's not that big a market. But if they're dedicated enough and they're good enough, they will. And hopefully that they will keep some of these old traditions. That I know the modern look of bespoke making is quite different, and the West End style of things is thought of as a little mothbally, you know, a little bit
old-fashioned.
Dull, old-fashioned, But it's not. There is a part of it that is probably a bit old and flaky. But if you search out some of the best of the West End shoes, they are stylish.
And I mean, especially now when we sort of wear the dress more casually, a lot of the like old style stuff that you can see at the shelves of Lobb or something like that would work perfect today.
And I've got some old Lobb lasts from before my time, And they are, if ever you come to my workshop, they are beautiful shapes. I mean, people's feet were different then. People were lighter, smaller. But they are beautiful shapes. And if I made a shoe on one of them today, you'd say, wow, what a lovely shape. So I just think these, because the flavour and the style that we like now, pitched heels, very narrow waists, very tight welts, very fine stitching, quite exaggerated shapes. That's fine for now. It will probably develop, and as all tastes change, don't they? But if we're not careful, if we've left some of the old looks and techniques behind, we'll look and think we've forgotten how that was done. All these different things. So that's my wish, that the young generation will go the way they see it, but take a glance back and try and take some of that with you. Exactly. And don't get too het up in the modern look, because those platform boots from the 70s that you may have in the cupboard somewhere, you may not dream of wearing them now, but in the day they were what you wanted to wear. You know what it's like with bespoke. With a bespoke customer, the world is your oyster, isn't it? But you have to say to them, please don't order that bright green zip-up boot, because you will not want to wear it in 6 months' time. Whereas if you order that lovely derby with an apron on it in a subtle colour, you will want to wear that for the rest of your life. So, I think shoemaking will transform, but it will always be there, because you cannot make a bespoke handmade shoe any other way, can you?
Yeah, exactly.
AI is not the same.
No, that's why it's still made so similar to how it was 100 years ago or 150 years ago.
Yeah, and that's what we like to say, is that if I could go back 100 years, it will not have changed much at all. It really won't. We make our own wax, we make our own threads, we make inks even, it's hardly changed,
And it's not that many things that sort of is like that, where you've already perfected it that long time ago.
The biggest problem is materials, that we can't get some of the materials. So the stuff, the hemp for the threads, we can't get the quality. A lot of us are using a Japanese style thread called rami, which is like a linen thread.
Yeah, that you sort of twist yourself.
Yeah. We can't get the ready-made waxes that were good, but we've just reverted back to making our own, And the quality of the leathers is more difficult.
That's a struggle for everyone, it seems. Yeah.
I know you've talked about that in other podcasts, about the leather. Things like the tools, awls and stuff like that are very hard to get. So the young makers struggle to get the lovely old tools that we've got. They're going to have a field day when I pop my clogs, because I've got the mother load of tools. I've got a fantastic collection of tools.
That's what you should start selling off to secure your pensions,
Well, maybe, maybe when I'm ready for that world cruise, I sell off a few irons and stuff. Yeah. But I'll make sure that they go to the right place.
Cool. I mean, it's been very interesting talk. Thanks a lot, Jim McCormack, for being part of the podcast.
Well, thanks, Jesper. I've enjoyed it, and onwards and upwards.
Yeah. Cheers. Thank you for listening in on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please give it a good rating or comment in your podcast player. The Shoegazing Podcast will be back with a new episode in a little while, so hear you again soon.